G'day and welcome back to another episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups. On this episode, I'm going to show you how to reassemble the bottom end of an A-Series engine. Now before we start, I just wanted to dedicate this episode to the late great John Schmidt, also known as the Mini King. At the day of filming, this is the day in which we say goodbye to an amazing man who was part of the mini culture in Australia. He was not only known in Australia for his wisdom, his kind words, his generosity and love of classic minis, but also an all-round humble person. Quite often I would ring overseas and ask different countries about classic mini parts, things that I wasn't able to get. And the first thing they would say to me is, have you tried the Mini King? Everyone knew him, whether you're in Australia or you're overseas. It is a significant loss to the classic mini community, not just Australia, but also worldwide. A man who had all the patience in the world and was able to give his time and energy to anyone who sat down and listened to him. He always told good stories and made you laugh. This was a gentleman that helped me get Grace back on the road when I was planning to get it ready for my wedding. Even on my wedding day, I rang him and asked for his advice. He was at a show, but he still gave the time to me to walk me through step by step the process in which I needed to work out what the problem was. John was a dear friend to me and I dedicate this episode to him. Thanks for being a part of my life, mate. Okay, so this episode, like I said, we're going to be assembling the bottom end of the Morris Minor. Now this is an A-Series engine, so it is very similar to a classic Mini. It does have a couple of differences, obviously being the crank, and the gearbox is also on the back of the engine, not on the sump side of it, which it normally is on a classic Mini or Moke. So let's go through a step-by-step process, and I really wanted to cut this episode down in this little series into a series of videos in which you can watch at different times so you can learn different things, but also someone that is after just some specific advice, they don't have to skip through 45 minutes of a video to find the exact thing that they want. So let's get into reassembling the bottom end. We're going to do the main bearing caps, which go along here. We're going to install the thrust washers, not only the bearing caps, but we're also going to install the new bearings. We're going to lubricate it, and I'm going to show you a couple of little tricks along the way and things that you need to look out for when assembling an engine. Alright, so as you can probably see, or maybe not even, there's a little bit of dust on this, but it's covered in a light film of oil, and I've just sprayed a little bit of WD-40 on there just to help keep it nice and lubricated, even though it's not actually going in the car just yet. So what I'm doing is just grabbing a rag and just cleaning it over of any of the mating surfaces. That way it just gets rid of any impurities. Now, generally when you get a crankshaft back from a machine shop, it is certainly advised to put the crankshaft either back in the engine block like this. That way it's not going to distort, or to stand it up on end with a bit of rope tied around there and hang it from the roof. Now the reason for that is, it is obviously balanced in different areas. Now if you were to lay a crankshaft on a flat bench, you would find over time it would slightly warp to the point in which you'd probably put in the car and you'd probably find you'd have a pretty bad vibration, and you'd probably even get excessive piston travel resulting in top end damage. Now it's definitely worthwhile noting to either leave it inside the block like this or even just hang it from something suspended with a bit of rope. Alright, so once it's all cleaned and it's all nice and smooth, we're then going to remove the crank, we're going to fit the new bearings and then start the reassembly. Alright, so once the crankshaft's out, we're then just going to get a rag. We're just going to dry off those surfaces on either part of the main cap, or the main bearings where it runs, should I say. Now when you install the new bearings, which is in this kit just here, they do machine it to suit exactly what you need. So the machine shop will generally either supply the bearings or they'll tell you exactly which ones you need to use. In our case, these are the 1 3/4 inch mains. Alright, so once you've opened it up, we're then going to start fitting the bearings. Now you will find that the bearings will only go in one particular way. So as you can probably see just here, there is a little lock tab on the side, and that just helps to prevent it from rotating. So what you need to do is install it like this, with the lock tab lined up with the line, and then push the bearing all the way home. Now it does need to be flush with both ends, so if it's a little bit high, just give it a little bit of a push with your thumb and just line it up. Repeat the same process all along here. All right, so the main bearings are in, or at least half of them anyway. What we're going to do next is we're going to put the crankshaft in. Now remember, the crankshaft will only go in one way. So if you put it in the wrong way, you're going to know pretty quickly that it's not actually going to work the way that it's meant to. So as you can see here, we do have a little bit of movement here. So what we need to now do is install the thrust washers, which often go between the center of the crankshaft here and the sides. The thrust washers enable the crankshaft to move laterally just a little bit, but also not too much. Too big of a gap is going to cause it to move back and forth when you apply your foot to the clutch, for instance. Too little movement with the engine warming up, it's going to create friction. Friction then creates heat. Heat creates then expansion, and then it's going to seize the crankshaft inside the block. All right, so as you can see, the green towel that's underneath, that's just to catch any debris or bolts I drop down there. That way they're not going to go bouncing all over the workshop. So I've got a set of standard thrust washers here. So let's open them up and get them fitted to the vehicle. So compared to what I've seen before on other engines, for instance a classic Mini, these are rather small, which is not going to be a problem. It's just a little bit different as each manufacturer does them a little bit differently. So we have 4 thrust washers. Now it's worthwhile noting 2 of them look like boomerangs. Yes, that's an Australian term. If you haven't used a boomerang before, have a go. And we have 2 with a locator on the ends. So what we need to do there is remove the crankshaft again, and we need to then determine which way it goes. Now on the bottom where the bearing runs, it's nice and smooth, which tells me the one that looks like a boomerang needs to sit directly in there. Now you can fit these dry, or you can put a little bit of oil or even lubricant on there just to hold it. Now, as you can see, one side is brass, the other side is steel. The brass side needs to face the crankshaft because that's the way that the crankshaft is going to be touching it. Every time you put the foot in the clutch or you get some sort of movement, it's going to be pushing here, or it's going to be pushing on the opposite side, which is going to be facing the other way. Now you can fit these dry, or you can apply a little bit of lubricant or even oil in there just to hold them in place. Once they're fitted, you can then refit the crankshaft. So just nice and easy, put it down in there. Now they might tend to move a little bit, but that's not an issue, simply because you can then put the bearing cap on and then it will sit in there nice and neat. So as you can see now, there's a little bit of movement, but nowhere near as much as what we had. Right, so the next thing is to grab the main bearing caps, which are these ones here. So there are 3 different types. We have the one with the rear main at this end, we have the center, and then we have the opposite end, which is where the crankshaft pulley is going to go. Now, as you can see here, you can see a witness mark as to where the old bearing shell has been sitting. So this line here is this one down here, which is where the bearing sits. So we know that this is going to go directly like this. So we have this bolt facing the outside. So where the oil pump pickup would go inside the block. So once again, wipe down the surface and then reinstall the new bearing shell. So we have it installed. Now, before we go any further, what we're going to be doing is installing the thrust washers on this end. So like I was saying before, there are a different type. We have one with a little notch cut out of the top. So that's going to sit one on one side and then the other directly on the other side. So once you've got it fitted and you have it lined up in the correct manner, you can then reinstall the bearing cap. Now they do have dowel pins to locate where the bearing cap actually sits, so ensure that you refit them when fitting the bearing caps. Otherwise it's not going to line up properly and it's going to be off center. In this instance, you don't want to be using any tools whatsoever other than just basic hand tools, only because you don't want to be over tightening it to start off with. Now in my case, I'm just using a ratchet to lightly tighten it. That way it'll help mate the 2 surfaces together. Once it stops, that's as far as I'm going to go until I've reassembled the rest of them and we've checked the end float. Now you're going to repeat the same process for the other 2 bearing caps. Now this being a Morris Minor, it does have a larger end at this end, which is where the rear main seal goes. So like I was saying in the episode in which we stripped this, it doesn't have a rear main oil seal, and this is a really good example as to see how it works. So if the oil manages to get past the bearing and get to this here, it then hits it and deflects backwards, therefore preventing the oil traveling any further. If it then happens to get past there, it has a corkscrew thread inside here. So as the crankshaft rotates, it actually forces the oil back inside there. If it leaks beyond here, well, then you've probably got bigger problems and bigger fish to fry. Now these are the dowels that I was speaking about here. So there's one there, and there's one there. These help line it up and keep it nice and square. Alright, so I'm just going to nip all these up just to make sure that they're tightened up properly. and then we can go and check the end float. Now, on previous videos when I've built an A-series engine, I reassembled all of this, I put a heap of grease on everything and found that nothing was done correctly and I had to pull it back apart. So we're only assembling this just to ensure that everything is working correctly and that we have the right amount of tolerance. So if we don't, we're going to have a catastrophic problem when reassembling it. And especially on something like this that a customer is expecting and wanting the best of the best out of all of my work. So if you have any problems, it is easier to rectify it now before it all going back together than pulling it all back apart once it's inside the car. So what we now need to do is work out how much end float we have. All right, so we got the old trusty dial gauge indicator. So that's gonna sit directly on the end of the crankshaft. I'll just move the camera so you guys can see. All right, so what we need to do is grab our dial gauge indicator and adjust it so we can set some preload on top of the needle. So I'm gonna give it about 50% preload. It doesn't really matter too much how much you actually give it. That way I can have a couple of mil either side. Not that it's going to move that much, but we want to make sure that it's going to be doing the right thing and it's going to be moving in the right amount of tolerance. Like I said, too little and it's going to seize and bind up inside the car, if not when running, but also applying the clutch. And if it's too much, then you're going to have excessive amount of movement, which is then going to cause premature wear and stress on other components. So I've got this set now to 0. What we need to now do is put a pry bar in here or even in another spot and lever it back and forth and find out how much movement we have. All right, so what I'm going to do is move it all the way one way first and then we're going to pull it all the way back. Now you don't want to be pulling too far on it, but you want to be ensuring that there's enough clearance there to give you a correct answer. So at the moment, without applying too much force, we're at about 6 thou, which is pretty good. So that's gone all the way back. Now we're gonna go back the opposite way and try and get a reading going the other way. All right, so I've pushed that as far that way as I possibly can, which is now moved up to about 9. So what I'm gonna do is just rotate this around and just re-zero it, and then we can re-measure the end float of the crank. Now this is a measurement that you want to be super precise with, but also you don't want to be sticking the pry bar down there and just pulling it so far that you're really stretching it beyond where it needs to be. So without applying too much force, we're sitting at approximately about 15 thou. So let's double check how much movement we actually need to have and what the specifications are. All right, so off camera, I just had myself a mini heart attack. I did a bit of research and I eventually found the answer I was looking for. Essentially, it is between 2 and 6 thou of an inch, which is equivalent to 0.05 of a millimeter to 0.15. So this is exactly where we need to be. I just had a look at the original packet and written on there in handwriting, you probably can't see it, but here it says NS, so November Sierra, .0123. So that to me kind of tells me the clearance in which this is, or what it would do up to, or even what it was at before being fitted. So he's probably worked out when the machinist has done all this, that's the clearance that we have, which is exactly pretty much what we've got at the moment. And this has all been done by Graham Russell, who is a guy who builds A-series engines and serious performance engines. So these are the sort of things that you want to be checking before you reassemble the engine. Never just put an engine together knowing that, you know, everything's been fine or it's tested without you actually doing the test yourself, only because you put it all back together, someone's calculations might have been wrong, could be the wrong size bearing, wrong size thrust washer, you put it all back together, find out that it's starved of oil, spins a bearing, destroys a crank, destroys a block, done, the engine's kaput. So it's always best to double check people's work, even though they are trained professionals, unless they build the entire engine for you, then leave it together. But if it is completely disassembled, make sure you triple check everything. So like I was saying, this is all within specs, that's fine. What we're now going to do is pull all of the end caps off. We're going to pull the crankshaft out. We're going to apply some lubricant or pre-assembly lube to each of the bearings, so the running surface where the actual crankshaft runs on the bearings. We're going to reassemble it, torque it all down, and then finish up the episode. All right, so I've undone all of the main bearing caps. To give it a bit of a wiggle, pull each one out one by one. You can grab yourself a soft face mallet, give it a couple of taps, just help free it up. Now for all those people watching at home thinking, oh, this guy's going crazy, he's going to destroy the engine. This is leather. That's what it's made out of. It is significantly softer than the brass that is on here. It's not going to damage it, guys. I'm sure someone in the comment section will tell me I'm doing it wrong. Pull them out, make sure you get your thrust washers. Pull the third and final one out. Oh, there we go. All right, so make sure that the bearings actually come with it. Now, we're going to pull the crankshaft out and we're going to put some assembly lubricant on there. All right, so Tomo's tech tip is to get yourself some engine assembly lube. This will help lubricate it when it is going together and help any oil to get in there prior to when you start it. So what you don't want to happen is for you to assemble it dry, and then lo and behold, you crank it over and it's got no lubricant there whatsoever to lubricate any of the bearings or any moving parts internally, and then before you know it, within a couple of seconds, you've had no oil pressure, it's done irreversible damage, and you now need to rebuild your engine. So like always, you don't really need a great deal, you just need enough to be able to sit it on there. So I'm just going to cover the mating surfaces of the bearings and then reinstall the crank and do the same. Now you only want to be placing it on the surface in which the crankshaft runs, not between the bearing and the actual block itself. Grab your crankshaft once again, make sure the thrust washers haven't moved. Refit it inside there. And then do the same to the main bearing caps. So once again, do the same thing. A little bit of assembly lubricant on the inside of the bearing. That way it just lubricates it and gives it a nice film of oil for it to start running on when you start the engine up. And it also helps to make it go together smoother. Don't forget the thrust washers for the middle end cap. Now you don't need a great deal of lubricant on here, you just need a little bit so it creates a film between there. Also remember, this is dissolvable, meaning that when you start up the engine, it's all going to dissipate, it's going to turn into engine oil, and it's going to come out with the first drain of oil that you do. Now it is worthwhile noting as well that when you finish rebuilding an engine, that you run it for about 500 kilometers, maybe even maximum of about 1,000 before draining the engine oil. Generally when you do, you want to make sure as well that you pull the filter apart and just make sure that there's no metal or debris in there from when you've drained the oil. Now the reason for that is you want to make sure that there's no debris hanging around inside the engine, and if there is, how much is in there, what size is it doing any damage, are you pulling it out of the sump, are you pulling it only out from the filter, etc, etc. Once again, I'm only doing these up tight with just a littlest amount of force, and then we're going to use a torque wrench and tighten them up properly. Alright, so next Tomo's tech tip is to get yourself a torque wrench. It doesn't need to be super fancy like this old school snap-on one. I've had this since I was an apprentice, so it's a good 15-year-old, but it does the job. So essentially we're going to set these bolts, or the set screws as they're called, to 60 pound-feet. So we're going to start in the middle. We're going to turn it slowly until we hear it beep. We're then going to double check it. So we click it again, and then we're going to go and check the opposite side, and then keep moving forward on all of the other bearing caps. So I always like to double check. Once you're happy with it, you can then go and do the others. So I'm just going to go and double check them all just to make sure that nothing's slipped, nothing's come off, I haven't incorrectly done them. Alright, so before we wrap it up, last thing to check is to make sure that it rotates freely. Last thing you want to do is put them in, tighten everything up, and find out that the incorrect bearings are in there and it's actually seizing the crank. Well everyone, that is the end of this episode. I know it was super short, but I hope it was super informative as to how to do this step by step. Like I said, I want to show a really easy video on how you can assemble this sort of stuff and do it yourself and take the time to be able to do it. There are a heap of things that you learn being a mechanic, and this is one of them. And it's not a process that I do all the time, but I do like to try and give back, as you guys know, to the community and to help people do these sort of jobs. It isn't hard, but you just need to make sure that you're really methodical and thought out about it all and get the job done right, because failure to do so, it's going to cause a catastrophic failure of the engine. So make sure you tune in to the next episode. We're going to be installing the con rods, the pistons, the piston rings, and the gudgeon pins into the pistons. So guys, that's it for this episode. Stay tuned and we'll see you right here on another episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups.